Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. So, what do I mean when I say a checklist is not a story? It's a little complicated, but let's start by going back to the definition that I use for story, which is a series of events with a narrative through line told by a storyteller to an audience in such a way that the audience can then repeat the story themselves. Now, when I first discussed this, I pointed out that a series of events in and of itself is not sufficient to create a story. After all, I can list 3 events: the fall of Rome, Christopher Columbus's first trip to the Americas, and the first nuclear weapon test of the Manhattan Project. That's a series of events. But there's no narrative through line. There's nothing that ties them together. There is no consequence that those actions cause one another. At least not directly, not in a way that makes a lot of intuitive sense to the human mind. You could draw those connections if you spent a lot of time working out the details and creating the narrative that will ultimately tie your story together, but until you've done that, your series of events is not a story. The narration frames these events in such a way that they cease to be disconnected points of data, and they become things that stem directly from one another. Without this kind of cause and effect, a story doesn't make a whole lot of sense to your audience, and it becomes extremely difficult for them to then repeat the story to an audience of their own. On the other hand, if you do have that narrative framing device, if you have character desires, and you have clear conflicts, and you have decisions that stem naturally from the established character and the established circumstances, it becomes very easy to follow a story from beginning to end. And the more you tell stories, the easier it becomes to follow a new story because you are better primed to pick up on those narrative devices that frame the events into a story. Okay, so far so good. We know that it is important to have a narrative through line to a story. But if that was all there was to it, I wouldn't need to make another video. I already covered that in my previous discussion of what makes a story. I wanted to spend a little time breaking down what that means more broadly, and what it means and how you should approach a story. See, it is often, not always, but often, the narrative through line, the framing of the events, that is most important to building your story, and not the events of your story themselves. However, most people seem to approach storytelling as assembling a series of events, a series of scenes. This is most common to people who have read writing books like Save the Cat. Save the Cat is a perfectly okay writing book. It has some pretty good lessons on scenes and what they do for the audience, and it is important to keep your audience in mind when you're writing a story, don't get me wrong. But it's a book on the writing craft that is directed towards producers, people who fund stories. It is a kind of analysis, which is why this video is following on the heels of my video about analysis and how that's not storytelling. You see, Save the Cat assembles a checklist of events that make a good story, and that makes it very useful for someone like a Hollywood producer who has to go through a bunch of scripts and decide whether he wants to fund them. If you have a checklist of things that need to be in a story in order for you to get your money back on it, then yes, have a checklist. But if you're trying to tell a story, a checklist is not going to help you tell that story. To return to a mantra I have on this channel, stories are specific. They are not general. And a checklist like Save the Cat presents you with a number of very broad, general beats. Introduce your hero, show them in their everyday life, show what they want to accomplish, show what's keeping them back, give a hook, something that makes us like them. These are all very good, sound things to keep in mind when you are assessing a story for how well it will appeal to an audience. It is not a good way to think when you're trying to write a story. You cannot just go through a story with a checklist and try and squeeze in all the bits that you want that make the story appealing. You can go and do that later. Like I said, analysis isn't bad. It's just the last 10% of the process. You need to get the other 90% in there before it's going to do you any good. Now, in my example from before, a series of historical events, there are a bunch of ways to present those events to people in a way that makes them a cohesive idea. They could be major events in the life of an immortal creature, or moments in time that are visited by time travelers, for one reason or another. But these are not narrative through lines either. They could be devices to build a narrative out of, but they are not the narrative themselves. By the same token, your story's theme is not its narrative through line. Your theme is the backbone of a narrative. It makes it more resonant and more relatable to your audience, at least ideally. Not always. You can execute on themes badly, but if you do it well, it will make your narrative more resonant, more immediate, more relatable to your audience. And that's a very good thing. But theme is not narrative either. Narrative is the specifics that cause one event to lead into the other. Narrative is cause and effect. These two things are, in my opinion, inseparable. If you cannot frame the events of your story in such a way that you can clearly see how one causes the next, and so on, you don't really have a story. You have an idea. Maybe you have some events, you have a theme, you have some plot devices, but you don't have a story yet without that element of cause and effect. It's very important to a story. Not just because it makes the story hold water, not just because it shows how your character is getting from point A to point B, but because it builds up the ability of your audience to repeat it. If there is a clear sequence of events where they have to happen in a specific order, that actually makes them easier to remember. Because as your audience turns into storytellers themselves, the ties between the events as they recount them will naturally lead them to follow the story to its natural conclusion. Even if they do get a detail wrong, as the consequences of that, in terms of cause and effect, begin to play out, the narrative will hopefully self-correct, and they will realize they have made a mistake. It is also very illuminating for an audience to tell a story this way and make some mistakes, because they begin to see the lines of cause and effect as they play out through this story. A great deal of what I learned about storytelling, believe it or not, came from trying to explain Star Trek episodes to friends who had never seen them, because when I was watching Star Trek The Next Generation, it was a dopey thing that you got picked on for doing, and I would always try and explain to people why no, Star Trek is really cool. And I would try to tell people about episodes, and they just usually laugh me off. But that's the way it went, you know? But as I struggled to maintain that causality, that narrative through line that made an episode of Star Trek work as I explained it to someone else, I began to realize what it was about those stories that interested me and what it was about the specifics of those stories that made them work. Not just so that I enjoyed them, but so they were coherent and so I could remember them and share them with other people. It is these lines of cause and effect that really tie your story together and make it memorable, make it repeatable, and make it strong. They turn your plot devices into a narrative. They turn your events into a story, and they turn your audience into storytellers. At least if you do it all correctly. And this is true of more than just the events in your story. There are a lot of people who want to treat the cast of your story like a checklist that they can just go down and fill with all the mandated roles. Or the ethics of your story, which just needs to have all the right lessons in it. These are also checklists that will distract you from telling your story through cause and effect, first and foremost. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to have certain morals in your story. But if the narrative through line of your story cannot support those morals, both your story and those morals will look terrible. And then they'll be forgotten, because your story is crap. And only masochists take the time to retell a crap story. That narrative through line is what makes everything else work. If you don't have it there as a container to hold everything else, well, everything else that you want to put in is just going to spill out on the ground. That's not ideal. Now, again, and I said this when I talked about analysis as well, this is not to say don't have checklists at all. They are very useful. And again, just like any kind of analysis is useful, having a list of things you want to put in your story can be very helpful. But it is not a substitute for putting in that really hard work that turns all of those things into a completed story. You need to weave all the elements together with the glue that binds your story together, that narrative, that cause and effect, that sense of one thing leading to another. That is what is going to make your story more than just an assemblage of all the parts you wanted to put in. At least that's just my thoughts. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.